The GH5S, what's new, what features does it have, and how does it differ from the GH5? Well, me and Ben are here in Slovenia, we're at Lake Bled and Triglav National Park, and we're going to be spending some time seeing the beautiful sights that are around here, and we've got a pre-production sample of the GH5S. No, not this is the GH5 because we're using the S to film this piece of the camera. But anyway, on this trip we're going to be comparing the two cameras and see what this new camera brings to the table. The GH5S's body looks pretty much the same as the GH5. It's still all housed in that splash dust and, especially important for where we are, freeze-proof mag alloy body. There are, however, some notable differences. The rear monitor is the same on both cameras, however the viewfinder is slightly different on the S, as it can now display at up to 120 frames per second. The other few changes I'll get onto later in the trip, but first let's move on to that sensor. A new 10.2 megapixel sensor is at the heart of the S, which is pretty much half the megapixel count compared to the GH5. So why less pixels? Well, it's the same size sensor, still of course micro four thirds, but by reducing the amount of pixels that make up the sensor, those remaining pixels can be bigger in size. The cell size of those pixels in the S are 1.96 times bigger than that of the GH5. Like Panasonic's flagship cameras, the VariCam and even the EVA1, the GH5S has dual native ISO, which means it's got two analog circuits that sit behind the sensor that have a native ISO, one of 400 and one of 2500, so you can get equally clean images at both of those ISOs. What does this all mean? Well, of course it means that you should get better low light performance, and in fact the GH5S is just under 2.5 times more sensitive than the GH5, which equates to about 7.5 dB of gain. The S also has an increased ISO range of 160 to 51,200 ISO. Compare that to the 200 to 12,800 that the GH5 was capable of, and that is a significant difference. But anyway, here are some nighttime shots in and around the village of Bled before we head back to our accommodation, as we look forward to the morning where we're going to hike to see something pretty magical. After a short hike, we've come to this awesome waterfall. Now, I'm not going to try and pronounce what it's called, I'll just embarrass myself, so I'll insert the name here so you can Google it and look for it yourself. But anyway, whilst we're talking about the sensor, if you had a GH1 or a GH2, then you'll be pleased to know that the GH5S has a multi-aspect ratio sensor. Now, if you're not familiar with what that means, well, as the name suggests, it means that you can actually shoot in different aspect ratios while utilizing the full sensor diagonally. You're never sacrificing that sensor realty estate. Now it also means as well, if you're shooting on a 25mm lens, let's say, if you're shooting in 4.3, 3.2, 16.9 or 17.9, that effective field of view isn't really going to change on that lens. It's especially useful if you're shooting a lot in anamorphic. And speaking of anamorphic, the advances to achieve that better low light performance and sensitivity does come at the cost of fewer pixels. And whilst the 10.2 megapixels in the GH5S is more than enough for 4K recording, it isn't anywhere near the resolution needed to record anamorphic 6K that the GH5 could do. Something to bear in mind if that was something that you used to use on the GH5. So what about the recording formats? Well, the headline feature here is improved 4K cinema or DCI recording capabilities. Now, the GH5 could do up to 24 frames a second in cinema 4K, where the GH5S can go up to 60 frames a second. Now, that's 60 frames a second in 8-bit 420, or if you go up to 30 frames a second, then you can do 10-bit 422. And now that really brings the GH5S to the table as a real contender for productions that require a true 4K delivery. And if you don't require a true 4K delivery, then that's still more resolution to play with if you're editing in 4K UHD, 2K or 1080p. Now, even though the GH5 could record 4K 10-bit 422 internally, it's still something worth shouting about with the S. You know, at the time of filming this video, these two cameras are really the only two cameras of their class that can do this internally. And if you're filming in Vlog or, any other flat profile that's going to be pushed and pulled in post, having that extra data is going to make a huge difference to your finished product. And for those GH4 and GH5 users, you will be pleased to hear that Vlog L comes as standard with the GH5S, so no additional purchases needed. So after a short drive around the lake and a very scenic gondola ride, we're now up here in Vogel Ski Resort. And we've come here to look at the slow motion recording capabilities of this new camera. Now, we've already covered that it can do 4K up to 60 frames a second, which is great. And if you're a UK shooter, that's realistically going to be up to 50 frames a second because we shoot PAL, which is 2 times slow motion in up to cinema 4K, which is fantastic. But the real headlines of this camera is its full HD slow motion recording, as this camera can do up to 240 frames a second continuous in full HD. Now you compare that to the GH5, which could do up to 180, and that's a considerable difference. So we've come here to try and capture some of the skiers do their thing, but before we do that, we're going to do some comparison shots to show that difference in frame rate, and we've picked one of the most extreme winter sports possible: sledding. Now, of course, all of these shots have been shot at 1080p and upscaled into this 4K UHD timeline. So here you can see 100 frames per second in 1080p. Now next up, we've got both cameras next to each other filming me going down this slope at exactly the same time. And the S on the left is at 240 frames per second, and the GH5 on the right is at 180 frames per second, which are both the maximum frame rates that these cameras can record. I'm just going to let this play through so you can see the sort of difference that this increase in speed makes. Now, one last thing I want to point out is that when you're shooting above 200 frames per second on the S, there will be a slight crop. On the left, we've got the S at 100 frames per second with no crop, and on the right, we've got the S at 240 frames per second with the slight crop. And if you look at the tree at the very far back of the frame, you will see just how much we are cropping in. And sadly, our time in Bled and Triglav has come to an end as we move on and drive to the capital, Ljubljana. Now I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I doubt that the flash sync port on the GH5 really got that much use. Let's face it, it's predominantly a video orientated camera, which is interesting to see that Panasonic have utilised this and added a secondary function to it. Now, with the help of this cable that's got a BNC connector at the end, the GH5S now supports timecode in and out, which is vital for when you're shooting on multi-camera shoots and multi-track audio productions too. When it comes to audio, the 3.5mm jack input on the side of this camera can now be set to line level, which is going to be particularly useful if you're working with pre-mixed audio or using external recorders like this little Tascam unit or even a Soundy. It just opens up the flexibilities of what type of audio feed this camera can now take. So one aspect that you may be surprised to hear about when it comes to the GH5S is that it doesn't have in-body stabilization in there. There are some pros though to getting rid of that stabilization, and that is that it's 65 grams lighter than the GH5, and also it has an extra battery lifetime. It's 440 shots compared to the 410 shots that you get with the GH5. In-body stabilization isn't something that's normally seen on the more, let's say, professional video cameras. It's kind of unheard of. When you look at the improvements to this camera, it's clearly pitched at a more professional, let's say, filmmaker camera operator, and this shouldn't be a feature that they'll miss. And to be honest, if you're shooting handheld, it's because you're looking for that handheld look. If you want smooth motion, then you'll use the appropriate professional support gear to make that motion smooth, you know, whether it be a slider, jib, Steadicam or a gimbal. So just before we come back to the airport to fly back home, we thought we'd stop off here in Piran. It's this beautiful little seaside village here on the edge of Slovenia on the Adriatic coast. And we thought it'd be a great spot to do the summary and the wrap up of how we found using the GH5. Actually, Ben, do you want to sit in here because you've been using the camera? We can do this together. Now, there's been one aspect that we've not really touched upon with the S, and that is its stills performance. So Ben, you're a photographer at heart. Maybe you're the person to talk about the still side of this camera.
Yeah. Now with the GH5S compared to the GH5, this will actually do 14-bit RAWs.
Yeah.
And if you're shooting continuously, that'll do up to 7 frames in AFC and 11 frames in AFS, and that's up to 60 RAWs as well. So comparing it to even most dedicated stills cameras,
yeah,
that's pretty respectable.
Yeah. And you couple that with its built-in intervalometer and time-lapse feature. Obviously the GH5 and the GH5S can do a time-lapse and create the video for you, which is great, but you'll also then have those 14-bit RAWs to play with in post should you need to tweak it. Okay, so we've got timecode in and out, we've got the removal of in-body stabilization and improvements to the Cinema 4K recording capabilities of the GH5S. You know, a mixture of these things, I think it really signifies who Panasonic are targeting with this camera, and that's, you know, that's the next level tier of filmmakers and camera operators, you know, especially if you're doing multi-tracker and multi-camera productions. Maybe we can just talk a little bit about the handling of the camera.
Yeah, I come from shooting Canon C100 as my, or C100 Mark II as my main camera for video, and which is a much larger form factor camera. I can travel a lot lighter with using something like the GH5 or GH5S, and be able to get up to some of the places that we went over the week.
We were able to carry a GH5, GH5S, selection of lenses, the audio gear, Mavic Pro, and also a Phaotech A2000 gimbal, all in the 2 bags that we were walking around with. You know, with the larger cameras, that might not have been possible on this trip. We've also not really touched upon autofocus. It's the same autofocus as the GH5, but because we've got the improved sensitivity with this sensor, it does go up to -5 EV, which is pretty impressive performance, right?
Yeah, I mean, even if you're using it for stills as well, -5 EV is very impressive by stills standards.
Yeah. So, I mean, in summary, we've really enjoyed our time shooting with this camera. Is the GH5S gonna get rid of the GH5? Probably not.
No.
It really depends on what type of filmmaking you do. You know, if you need better sensitivity and you need timecode because you're doing multi-camera productions, then the GH5S is probably going to be more aligned to what you actually need. Whereas if you're doing a lot of handheld filmmaking, you know, even more so at longer focal length ranges, then the GH5 is probably going to be more accustomed to what you might need, especially if you also want to do stills as well, because you have got more megapixels to play with.
Yeah.
We've really enjoyed shooting with both of these cameras. In an ideal world, I'd have them both if I had the money to do that. But the GH5S, some great low light capabilities with that camera, which is one of the biggest concerns with any micro four thirds shooter out there, I think.
Yeah.
So, I hope you've enjoyed this video, guys. For more information and news, reviews, tips and tricks all around video production, head over to wex.co.uk.